The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window, watching her children play in the garden below. Prince George was teaching his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, how to kick a football properly, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. For a moment, everything felt normal, peaceful even. But Catherine knew that normalcy was about to become a luxury she could no longer afford. The phone call had come 3 days earlier, delivered in the measured tones of Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary. The constitutional monarchy was evolving, he had explained, and, with it, the expectations placed upon senior working royals. New protocols were being established, traditions were being reassessed, and certain freedoms that Catherine had grown accustomed to would need to be reconsidered in the interest of the crown's dignity and security. Catherine had listened in silence, her heart sinking with each carefully worded restriction. She had married into the royal family understanding that her life would change dramatically, but after more than a decade as a working royal, she had found her rhythm, her way of balancing duty with motherhood, tradition with modernity. Now, it seemed that balance was being recalibrated without her input. The first and perhaps most painful restriction concerned her children's education and her involvement in their daily school activities. For years, Catherine had been a hands-on mother, dropping her children off at school, attending parent-teacher conferences, and participating in school events whenever her royal duties permitted. She had fought hard to maintain these moments of normalcy for George, Charlotte, and Louis, believing that royal children deserve to experience childhood as authentically as possible within the constraints of their position. But the security assessment had changed everything. Recent global events and increased threats against the royal family had prompted a comprehensive review of security protocols. The conclusion was stark. Catherine's presence at routine school functions posed an unacceptable risk, not just to herself and her children, but to other families and students. The elaborate security arrangements required for even the simplest school pickup created disruption and drew unwanted attention to the children. Catherine remembered the meeting with the head of security, a stern woman named Commander Sarah Mitchell, who had laid out the new reality with military precision. School pickups would now be handled by protection officers. Parent-teacher conferences would be conducted virtually or at secure locations away from the school premises. Sports days, Christmas concerts, and other school events would require such extensive security measures that Catherine's attendance would fundamentally alter the nature of these occasions for every other family involved. The princess had argued passionately against these restrictions. She had pointed to other royal families across Europe who managed to maintain more normal relationships with their children's education. She had emphasized the importance of maternal presence in her children's formative years. But the security concerns were deemed non-negotiable, and the emotional cost to Catherine was considered an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice. As she watched her children play, Catherine thought about the conversation she would need to have with them that evening. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that Mummy won't be there to cheer him on at his next football match because her presence might endanger his classmates? How do you tell a 6-year-old girl that the queen-in-waiting can't attend her school play because the security arrangements would overshadow the performance itself? The second major restriction involved Catherine's charitable work and her direct engagement with the public. Throughout her years as a working royal, Catherine had prided herself on her hands-on approach to her patronages. She didn't just lend her name to causes. She rolled up her sleeves and got involved. She had spent nights in homeless shelters, worked shifts at food banks, and sat on the floor of children's hospices, reading stories and offering comfort to families in their darkest moments. But the new protocols demanded a more formal approach. Spontaneous visits were banned entirely. Every charitable engagement would require weeks of advanced planning, security sweeps, and carefully controlled interactions. The authentic moments that had defined Catherine's charitable work, the impromptu conversations with struggling mothers, the unscripted exchanges with vulnerable young people, would be virtually impossible under the new restrictions. Catherine remembered a particular visit to a women's refuge in East London just 6 months earlier. She had been scheduled for a brief tour and photo opportunity, but when she met Maria, a young mother fleeing domestic violence with her 2 young children, the formal agenda had gone out the window. Catherine had spent 2 hours with Maria, listening to her story, playing with her children, and offering practical advice about navigating the benefit system and finding stable housing. That interaction had led to real change. Catherine had personally followed up on Maria's case, connecting her with additional support services and ensuring she received the help she needed. 6 months later, Maria was in stable housing with a part-time job, and her children were thriving in school. It was exactly the kind of direct, personal impact that Catherine valued most about her role. Under the new protocols, such meaningful engagement would be impossible. Every interaction would be choreographed, every conversation monitored for security purposes. The vulnerable people Catherine most wanted to help would be screened and vetted in advance, creating an artificial environment that served the needs of protocol rather than those seeking help. The third restriction cut even deeper into Catherine's personal life, her freedom of movement and spontaneous family activities. For years, despite the constant presence of protection officers, Catherine had maintained certain freedoms. She could decide on a whim to take the children to a local playground. She could stop at a farm shop on the way home from an engagement. She could attend friends' dinner parties with relatively minimal fuss. But the threat assessment had determined that these spontaneous activities created too many security vulnerabilities. Every outing would now require advanced planning and security sweeps. Restaurants would need to be vetted, other patrons would need to be screened, and emergency evacuation routes would need to be established. The simple pleasure of deciding to grab ice cream with her children on a sunny afternoon would become a logistical operation involving multiple government agencies. Catherine thought about the previous weekend, when she had taken Charlotte and Louis to a local pumpkin patch for an impromptu autumn outing. They had wandered through the fields, selecting the perfect pumpkins for carving, and had enjoyed hot chocolate and homemade biscuits in the farm cafe. Other families had been there with their children, creating a warm, communal atmosphere that had felt wonderfully normal despite the discreet presence of protection officers. Under the new protocols, such an outing would require days of advanced planning. The pumpkin patch would need to be secured, other visitors would need to be cleared in advance, and the spontaneous joy of the experience would be lost in the machinery of royal security. The very normalcy that Catherine treasured for her children would become impossible to maintain. The fourth major change involved Catherine's relationship with the media and her ability to control her own narrative. Throughout her time as a working royal, Catherine had developed a sophisticated understanding of media relations. She had learned to use photography and carefully manage media access to highlight important causes and maintain public support for the monarchy. But the new protocols included strict limitations on media engagement. All interviews would need pre-approval from the palace communications team. Photography sessions would be limited to official royal photographers. Social media posts would require review by multiple departments before publication. The authentic voice that Catherine had developed over the years would be filtered through layers of palace bureaucracy. Catherine had always believed that authenticity was crucial to the monarchy's relevance in the modern world. Her ability to speak genuinely about mental health, early childhood development, and other causes close to her heart had helped connect the royal family with younger generations. But the new restrictions would sanitize her public communications, potentially undermining the very relevance she had worked so hard to build. As the afternoon sun began to set over Kensington Palace, Catherine finally stepped away from the window and prepared to face the reality of her changed circumstances. The protection officer stationed outside her door gave a respectful nod as she emerged, a reminder that even within the supposed sanctuary of her own home, her every movement was monitored and assessed for potential risks. She made her way to the nursery, where Louis was having his afternoon nap. Standing beside his crib, watching his peaceful sleep, Catherine felt the full weight of the sacrifices that lay ahead. Her youngest child, barely more than a toddler, would grow up with even fewer opportunities for normal experiences than his older siblings. The casual freedoms that George and Charlotte had enjoyed in their early years would be denied to Louis entirely. The irony was not lost on Catherine. As her husband William moved closer to the throne, as their own status within the royal family became more central, the human experiences that had shaped her own character and values were being systematically stripped away. The spontaneity, the authentic connections with people from all walks of life, the simple maternal pleasures of being present for her children's daily experiences, all of these were being sacrificed on the altar of royal protocol and security concerns. But perhaps the most painful aspect of these changes was their irreversible nature. This wasn't a temporary adjustment or a brief period of heightened security. This was the new reality for the rest of her life and the lives of her children. Every birthday party, every school sports day, every family holiday would be filtered through the machinery of royal security and protocol. The woman who had once been Kate Middleton, free to live an ordinary life with occasional extraordinary moments, was disappearing entirely, replaced by an institution in human form. As Catherine prepared to return to her children in the garden, to give them a few more moments of carefree play before explaining their new reality, she carried with her a profound sense of loss. Not just for herself, but for the authentic connections and genuine experiences that would no longer be possible. The royal family was evolving to meet the challenges of the modern world, but that evolution came at a cost that would be measured not in pounds or protocol, but in the currency of human experience and maternal presence. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the palace grounds, and Catherine steeled herself for the difficult conversations that lay ahead. Her children deserved to understand why their world was about to become smaller, more controlled, more distant from the ordinary experiences of childhood. And somehow, she would need to help them see these restrictions not as losses, but as the price of the extraordinary privilege and responsibility that came with their royal birth. The weeks following the implementation of the new protocols passed in a blur of adjustment and quiet rebellion. Catherine found herself testing the boundaries of her new restrictions, not out of defiance, but out of a desperate need to understand exactly how much of her former life had been lost. Each small test revealed another layer of control that had been placed around her existence. It started with something as simple as grocery shopping. Catherine had always taken pride in her ability to occasionally slip into a local Waitrose or Tesco, choosing ingredients for family dinners or selecting treats for the children. These excursions, while always accompanied by protection officers, had provided her with a connection to ordinary life that she treasured. She enjoyed chatting with checkout assistants who had grown familiar with her occasional visits, and she valued the simple act of selecting her family's food herself. But when she mentioned to her private secretary that she wanted to pick up ingredients for George's birthday cake, the response was swift and unequivocal. Such spontaneous shopping trips were no longer possible. All household provisions would be sourced through approved suppliers who had undergone extensive security vetting. If Catherine wanted specific ingredients for a special occasion, they could be obtained through the palace's procurement system, but personal shopping expeditions were deemed too risky. The security briefing that followed was thorough and sobering. Commander Mitchell explained that grocery stores presented multiple security vulnerabilities: crowded spaces with multiple exit points, potential for contaminated products, opportunities for hostile actors to blend in with ordinary shoppers, and the impossibility of securing such large, public spaces without causing massive disruption to other customers. Catherine listened to these explanations with growing frustration. She understood the logic, but she also understood what was being lost. The brief conversations with other mothers in the cereal aisle, the impromptu encounters with members of the public who might offer a kind word or share concern about their own families. These interactions had kept her grounded in the reality of life outside the palace walls. The birthday cake incident became symbolic of a larger loss. Catherine had always prided herself on baking for her children's birthdays, a tradition that connected her to her own mother's approach to child-rearing. But when she discovered that even the ingredients for George's cake would need to be sourced through official channels, tested for contaminants, and approved by security personnel, the spontaneous joy of the gesture was lost. She spent an evening in the palace kitchens anyway, working alongside the pastry chefs to create George's birthday cake. But the knowledge that every ingredient had been processed through multiple layers of bureaucracy, that even this simple maternal act had become an official palace function, left her feeling disconnected from the very purpose of the gesture. The children's reactions to their new restrictions were perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the transition. George, at 8 years old, was beginning to understand the weight of his future responsibilities, and he accepted the changes with a stoicism that worried Catherine. When she explained that she wouldn't be able to attend his upcoming school football match, he simply nodded and said he understood that being future king meant making sacrifices. But Catherine saw the disappointment in his eyes, the way he glanced toward the window when she thought he wasn't looking, as if hoping to see her arriving at the last minute despite the restrictions. She had always been his most enthusiastic supporter at sporting events, cheering from the sidelines with an enthusiasm that sometimes embarrassed him, but that he clearly treasured. Charlotte's reaction was more direct and emotional. At 6 years old, she couldn't fully grasp the security concerns that necessitated the changes, and she responded with the raw honesty of childhood. When Catherine explained that she wouldn't be able to attend the school's Christmas concert, Charlotte burst into tears and demanded to know why other mothers could come, but hers couldn't. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Catherine's life. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mother's presence at a school concert could endanger other children? How do you help a child understand that the monarchy she will one day serve requires sacrifices that begin in childhood and never end? Louis, at 3 years old, was too young to understand the abstract concepts of security and protocol, but he felt the changes in the family's rhythm. He began asking why they didn't go to the park as often, why their visits to see friends required so much planning, why Mummy seemed sad even when she was smiling. The impact on Catherine's friendships proved to be another unexpected consequence of the new protocols. For years, she had maintained relationships with friends from her pre-royal life and had developed new friendships within the social circle she moved in as a working royal. These relationships had provided crucial emotional support and perspective, reminding her of who she had been before titles and duties defined her existence. But the new security requirements made casual socializing nearly impossible. Dinner parties at friends' homes required advanced security sweeps that felt invasive and disruptive. The spontaneous coffee dates and informal gatherings that had sustained these friendships became logistical challenges that few people were willing or able to accommodate. Catherine found herself increasingly isolated, surrounded by palace staff and official functions, but disconnected from the informal relationships that had helped her maintain her sense of self. The friends who had known Kate Middleton gradually faded from her life, not through any lack of affection, but because the practical difficulties of maintaining these relationships had become insurmountable. The loss of authentic peer relationships was compounded by changes in Catherine's professional engagements. Her patronages and charitable work, which had been sources of personal fulfillment and public connection, became increasingly formal and scripted. The spontaneous moments that had defined her approach to royal duties, the unplanned conversations, the impromptu extensions of scheduled visits, the genuine connections with people facing difficult circumstances, were systematically eliminated. During a visit to a children's hospital, Catherine felt the full impact of these changes. In the past, she had been able to spend unhurried time with young patients, sitting on their beds, reading stories, or simply listening to their concerns. These interactions had been mutually beneficial. The children received comfort and attention from a caring adult, while Catherine gained perspective on the challenges facing ordinary families. But the new protocols required that all interactions be timed and monitored. Each conversation was limited to prevent fatigue and security risks. The children she met had been pre-selected based on their medical stability and their family security clearances. The authentic moments of connection that had made these visits meaningful for everyone involved were replaced by carefully choreographed encounters that felt hollow and performative. Catherine left the hospital feeling frustrated and unfulfilled. She had smiled for the cameras, delivered the appropriate words of encouragement, and fulfilled her official duties, but she knew that the genuine impact she had once been able to make in these settings was no longer possible. The children she met would remember meeting the Princess of Wales, but they wouldn't remember feeling truly seen and heard by another person who cared about their well-being. The cumulative effect of these changes was a growing sense of disconnection from the very people and causes that had given meaning to her role as a working royal. Catherine had always believed that the monarchy's relevance depended on its ability to connect with and serve the needs of ordinary people. But the new protocols created barriers between her and the public that made such connections increasingly difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, the palace machinery continued to function with apparent seamlessness. Press releases announced her successful engagements. Photographs captured her smiling interactions with members of the public, and her approval ratings remained high. From the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. But Catherine knew that the substance of her work, the authentic connections that had made her royal role personally meaningful, had been fundamentally altered. The pressure to maintain the appearance of normalcy while adapting to these profound changes created an additional strain. Catherine found herself constantly performing contentment and fulfillment while privately grieving the loss of freedoms and connections that had defined her approach to royal life. The emotional labor of this performance was exhausting, particularly when combined with the challenges of helping her children adjust to their own new restrictions. Evening conversations with William became exercises in careful diplomacy. He was supportive and understanding, but he was also preparing for his own eventual ascension to the throne, and the security concerns that affected Catherine were even more pronounced for the future king. William had grown up with these restrictions and understood them as necessary costs of royal life, but Catherine had come to the monarchy as an adult with established patterns of behavior and relationship. The couple found themselves navigating different perspectives on the changes. William saw them as unfortunate but necessary adaptations to evolving security threats and constitutional requirements. Catherine experienced them as fundamental attacks on her identity as a mother and her effectiveness as a working royal. These different perspectives created tension in their marriage that required careful management and frequent discussion. Catherine began to understand that her role was evolving from that of a working royal who happened to be a princess into that of a future queen who was being systematically prepared for the ultimate sacrifice of personal autonomy. Every restriction, every protocol, every limitation was designed to transform her from an individual into an institution. The process was gradual but relentless, and resistance was not only futile but potentially damaging to the monarchy itself. As autumn deepened into winter, Catherine found herself spending more time in private reflection, trying to reconcile her personal losses with her public responsibilities. She began keeping a private journal, recording not her official activities, but her emotional responses to the changes in her life. Writing became a way of preserving some record of the person she had been before the protocols changed, a way of maintaining connection with aspects of herself that were being systematically erased from her public existence. The journal entries revealed the depth of her struggle to find meaning and fulfillment within her new constraints. She wrote about missing the sound of other parents cheering at George's football matches, about longing to surprise Charlotte with an impromptu ice cream outing, about wanting to respond authentically to the homeless individuals she met during official visits rather than following carefully scripted protocols. But the journal also revealed Catherine's growing understanding of the historical significance of her situation. She was living through a transformation in the nature of monarchy itself, adapting to threats and challenges that previous generations of royals had never faced. The protocols that felt so restrictive were also protective measures designed to ensure the stability and continuity of an institution that had served the nation for over 1,000 years. Winter arrived early at Kensington Palace, bringing with it a stark beauty that seemed to mirror Catherine's internal landscape. The bare branches of ancient oak trees stood sentinel against gray skies, their skeletal forms creating patterns of shadow and light that shifted throughout the shortened days. Catherine found herself drawn to these windows more frequently, watching the world beyond the palace walls with a longing that had grown stronger with each passing week. The holiday season brought new challenges and revelations about the extent of her changed circumstances. Christmas had always been Catherine's favorite time of year, a period when royal duties often took on a more personal character and family traditions could flourish alongside official obligations. But the new protocols extended even to seasonal celebrations, transforming familiar rituals into carefully orchestrated events that bore little resemblance to the intimate family gatherings Catherine had envisioned. The annual Christmas shopping expedition, once a cherished tradition where Catherine would spend days selecting personal gifts for each family member, had been replaced by a system of approved vendors and vetted options. Personal shopping assistants now presented her with curated selections based on detailed profiles of intended recipients, while security personnel reviewed each potential purchase for appropriateness and safety concerns. Catherine remembered the previous year's shopping adventure with Charlotte, when they had spent an afternoon wandering through Harrods, examining toys and books, discussing what might delight Louis and surprise William. Charlotte had taken her role as gift consultant seriously, offering opinions on everything from picture books to sporting goods. The expedition had concluded with hot chocolate in the store's cafe, where Charlotte had confided her hopes for her own Christmas gifts and her concerns about whether Father Christmas knew where to find royal children. This year, Charlotte's Christmas shopping experience consisted of reviewing photographs and descriptions provided by the palace's procurement team. The magic of discovery, the joy of finding the perfect, unexpected gift, the simple pleasure of mother and daughter sharing an afternoon of preparation for family celebration. All of these have been eliminated in favor of efficient, secure, predetermined outcomes. The impact extended beyond shopping to the very nature of gift-giving itself. Catherine learned that all presents exchanged within the royal household would now be subject to security screening and approval processes. The handmade scarves she had knitted for her protection officers, the personalized photo albums she had created for family members, the carefully selected books with handwritten inscriptions, all of these personal touches that had made gift-giving meaningful would need to be vetted and approved by committees of people who had no emotional investment in the relationships they were meant to celebrate. When Catherine mentioned her plan to bake Christmas biscuits with the children, following recipes passed down from her grandmother, she discovered that even this simple tradition would require modification. All ingredients would need to be sourced through approved suppliers. The baking process would need to be supervised by palace staff, and the finished biscuits would need to be tested for safety before they could be consumed or given as gifts. The children's reactions to these changes in their Christmas traditions were particularly painful for Catherine to witness. George, showing maturity beyond his 8 years, simply nodded when she explained why they wouldn't be able to deliver their usual Christmas hampers to local families in person. But she saw the confusion in his eyes, the struggle to understand why acts of kindness had become security risks. Charlotte was more vocal in her disappointment. When she learned that their Christmas Eve tradition of walking to the local church for midnight service would need to be replaced by a private chapel service within the palace grounds, she asked why God couldn't protect them in his own house if he could protect them everywhere else. The theological and philosophical complexities of her question highlighted the impossible task of explaining adult fears and institutional requirements to a child's innate sense of right and wrong. The church service controversy became emblematic of the broader changes in Catherine's spiritual and community life. She had always found solace in worship, particularly in moments when she could join congregations as simply another member seeking comfort and guidance. The anonymity possible in larger churches, the sense of being part of a community united in faith rather than separated by titles and protocols, have been crucial to her spiritual development. But the security assessment had determined that Catherine's presence at any public worship service created unacceptable risks to other congregants. The advanced security sweeps, the screening of other worshipers, the establishment of evacuation procedures, all of these measures would fundamentally alter the nature of worship for everyone present. The peaceful sanctuary that Catherine sought would become a security operation that defeated its own purpose. The private chapel services arranged as alternatives felt hollow to Catherine. While beautiful and reverent, they lacked the communal energy that she found spiritually nourishing. Worship became another official function rather than a personal refuge, another box to be checked on the calendar rather than a source of authentic renewal. These spiritual restrictions were compounded by changes in Catherine's ability to seek pastoral counseling and guidance. Her relationships with clergy, once informal and confidential, now required security clearances and official protocols. The conversations that had helped her navigate the challenges of royal life became official consultations subject to record-keeping requirements and security oversight. The loss of spiritual privacy and community connection was particularly difficult given the emotional challenges Catherine was facing in adapting to her new restrictions. She had always relied on faith and spiritual guidance to help her find meaning and purpose in difficult circumstances, but the institutional barriers now surrounding even these most personal aspects of life left her feeling isolated in her struggles. Meanwhile, the impact of the protocol changes on Catherine's extended family relationships became increasingly apparent. Her parents, Carol and Michael Middleton, found themselves subject to new security requirements whenever they wanted to visit their grandchildren. Spontaneous family gatherings became impossible, and even planned visits required advanced coordination with palace security staff. The natural grandparent relationship that had developed over the years was fundamentally altered by these new requirements. Simple pleasures like Carol arriving with fresh-baked treats or Michael taking the children for impromptu garden walks became security events that required planning and supervision. The easy intimacy of extended family relationships was strained by the constant awareness that every interaction was being monitored and assessed for potential risks. Pippa, Catherine's sister, found her own relationship with the royal family affected by the new protocols. Once able to visit casually and maintain a relatively normal sibling relationship, she now discovered that her presence near Catherine required security clearances and background checks. The informal support system that had helped Catherine maintain her sense of identity and connection to her pre-royal life was systematically dismantled in the name of security and protocol. The children felt these changes acutely. Their relationships with their Middleton grandparents had provided them with experiences of normal family life that balanced the formal requirements of their royal identity. Carol's willingness to get down on the floor and play games, Michael's enthusiasm for teaching them about gardening and nature, Pippa's fun and energy, all of these relationships became more formal and constrained under the new security requirements. Catherine watched her children losing these authentic family connections and felt powerless to preserve the simple human relationships that she believed were crucial to their emotional development. The royal children already faced unique challenges in forming genuine friendships and understanding normal family dynamics. The new protocols made these challenges even more pronounced. The professional impact of the protocol changes continued to evolve throughout the winter months. Catherine discovered that her ability to respond to current events and social issues was now severely restricted. In the past, she had been able to make spontaneous statements or gestures in response to national tragedies or social movements, often providing comfort and solidarity when the public needed it most. But the new communication protocols required that all public statements be reviewed by multiple palace departments before release. The timeline for these approvals meant that by the time Catherine was permitted to respond to urgent social issues, the moment for meaningful intervention had often passed. Her voice, once an authentic and timely presence in national conversations, became delayed and filtered through institutional concerns that prioritize caution over relevance. When a major flooding disaster affected communities in northern England, Catherine's desire to visit affected areas and offer direct assistance was channeled through official palace procedures that took weeks to implement. By the time she was able to make an official visit to the region, the immediate crisis had passed, media attention had moved on, and her presence felt more like a photo opportunity than genuine assistance. Catherine understood the security concerns that necessitated these delays, but she also understood that the monarchy's relevance depended partly on its ability to respond meaningfully to the nation's needs in moments of crisis. The new protocols were creating a gap between royal intentions and royal impact that concerned her deeply. Her frustration was compounded by the realization that these restrictions were not temporary measures, but permanent changes to the nature of her role. The security threats that justified the protocols were not diminishing. If anything, they were becoming more sophisticated and persistent. The freedom and spontaneity that had characterized her early years as a working royal were gone forever, replaced by a system of controls and procedures that would only become more elaborate as William moved closer to the throne. The winter months also brought unexpected challenges in maintaining her physical and mental health within the new constraints. Catherine's exercise routine, which had always included outdoor activities like running and cycling, was now subject to security restrictions that made spontaneous physical activity impossible. Even her use of the palace's private gym required advanced coordination with security staff and careful attention to windows and sightlines that might provide opportunities for surveillance. Her mental health suffered from the increasing isolation and loss of authentic connections. The relationships and activities that had previously provided emotional sustenance were being systematically removed or transformed beyond recognition. The simple pleasures that had helped her maintain perspective and find joy in her demanding role were replaced by official equivalents that served institutional needs rather than personal ones. Catherine found herself struggling with questions about identity and purpose that she hadn't faced since her early days as a working royal. Who was she becoming under these new constraints? How could she maintain her sense of self while adapting to requirements that seemed designed to eliminate individuality in favor of institutional function? What kind of mother, wife, and public figure could she be within a system that prioritized security and protocol over human connection and authentic engagement? The journal she had begun keeping became her primary outlet for processing these questions. In its pages, she explored the tension between duty and personal fulfillment, between the monarchy's institutional needs and her own emotional requirements. The writing helped her identify patterns in her responses to the changes and develop strategies for finding meaning within her new constraints. But even this private space for reflection was not entirely secure. Catherine was aware that all palace communications, including personal documents, could potentially be subject to security review. The knowledge that even her most private thoughts might not remain private added another layer of constraint to her already circumscribed existence. Spring arrived at Kensington Palace with a burst of unexpected warmth, transforming the formal gardens into a celebration of renewal that seemed almost defiant in its beauty. Catherine stood among the newly bloomed daffodils and tulips, watching her children discover the small miracles of emerging life that had somehow survived the harsh winter. In these moments of natural wonder, she found glimpses of the joy and spontaneity that had been slowly disappearing from their lives over the past months. But even this simple pleasure was tinged with the awareness of change. The children's exploration of the gardens was now accompanied by the discreet but constant presence of additional security personnel. What had once been free-ranging childhood adventure had become carefully supervised outdoor time, with invisible boundaries and unspoken limitations that the children were gradually learning to navigate without conscious awareness. The transformation was most evident in Lewis, who at 4 years old was developing his understanding of the world through these new restrictions rather than despite them. Unlike his older siblings, who remembered a time of greater freedom, Lewis was adapting to a reality where every activity required permission, every outing demanded planning, and every spontaneous impulse was filtered through considerations of safety and protocol. Catherine watched him playing with a butterfly that had landed on a nearby rose bush, his natural curiosity constrained by learned caution. He looked to the protection officer for approval before stepping closer to examine the butterfly, a gesture that broke Catherine's heart with its unconscious acceptance of surveillance as normal. This was the generation that would grow up never knowing the simple freedom of exploring their own garden without institutional oversight. The spring season also marked the implementation of the most significant change yet to the family's public role. Catherine learned that her appearances at all future state functions would be subject to new levels of ceremonial protocol that effectively eliminated any possibility of genuine human connection during these events. The careful balance she had developed between formal duty and authentic engagement would be replaced by strict adherence to prescribed behaviors and responses. The first test of these new ceremonial protocols came during a state dinner for visiting dignitaries from a Commonwealth nation. Catherine had always viewed such events as opportunities to represent British values of hospitality and genuine interest in other cultures, engaging in substantive conversations about shared challenges and opportunities for cooperation. But the new protocol required that all her interactions follow carefully scripted patterns. Conversation topics were predetermined, discussion points were rehearsed in advance, and even her expressions of interest or concern were choreographed to ensure they conveyed appropriate diplomatic messages without risk of misinterpretation or controversy. Catherine found herself delivering what felt like a performance rather than participating in genuine diplomatic discourse. The visiting dignitaries responded to her scripted pleasantries with their own formal replies, creating conversations that served ceremonial purposes but lacked any authentic exchange of ideas or perspectives. The evening, while diplomatically successful, left Catherine feeling like she had become a beautiful but ultimately decorative element in a larger institutional production. The impact on her sense of professional fulfillment was profound. Catherine had always taken pride in her ability to represent Britain effectively in international settings, believing that her genuine curiosity about other cultures and her natural warmth could help strengthen relationships between nations. But the new protocols reduced her role to that of a ceremonial figure whose primary function was to embody royal dignity rather than engage in meaningful diplomatic work. This ceremonial transformation extended to her domestic engagements as well. During a visit to a new community center in a disadvantaged area of London, Catherine discovered that her interactions with local residents had been carefully staged to ensure optimal security and media coverage. The people she met had been pre-selected and briefed, their questions prepared in advance, their responses coached to provide appropriate sound bites for news coverage. The authentic conversations that had once made such visits meaningful for both Catherine and the communities she met were replaced by theatrical exchanges that served publicity purposes but provided little genuine connection or understanding. Catherine left the community center knowing that she had fulfilled her official duties, but uncertain whether her presence had made any real difference in the lives of the people she was meant to serve. The children's education continued to be affected by the expanding security requirements. George's transition to a new school had been managed entirely by palace staff, with Catherine playing no role in the selection process or the integration activities that typically marked such important milestones in a child's development. She learned about his new teachers, his classroom environment, and his educational progress through formal reports rather than through the casual conversations and direct involvement that had characterized her relationship with his previous school. Charlotte's artistic development, which Catherine had been carefully nurturing through visits to galleries and hands-on creative activities, was now channeled through approved art tutors and palace-based instruction. The impromptu visits to children's art workshops, the spontaneous exploration of museum exhibitions, the simple pleasure of sitting together in a cafe, sketching people and objects that caught their attention. All of these experiences that had fostered Charlotte's creativity were replaced by formal lessons that felt more like obligations than discoveries. The loss of these educational freedoms was particularly painful because Catherine understood their long-term implications. Her children were being raised to become effective working royals, but they were also being systematically denied the diverse experiences and authentic relationships that typically contribute to emotional intelligence, empathy, and understanding of the world beyond privilege. Catherine began to recognize patterns in how the protocol changes were reshaping not just her own life, but the entire family's relationship with the world. Every restriction created a layer of separation between the royal family and the experiences that inform normal human development. The children were being protected from physical dangers, but exposed to the more subtle risks of isolation and disconnection from the realities that shaped most people's lives. The summer brought unexpected challenges when Catherine's attempt to maintain one small tradition, the family's annual camping trip to Balmoral, was transformed beyond recognition by security requirements. What had once been a rustic retreat where the children could experience outdoor life with minimal technology and maximum freedom became a carefully orchestrated exercise in controlled wilderness experience. The camping now took place in specially constructed and security-screened temporary structures that bore little resemblance to the simple tents they had used in previous years. The children's activities were supervised by personnel trained in both outdoor education and personal protection. Even their campfire songs required approval to ensure they didn't contain lyrics that might be considered inappropriate for royal children to be recorded singing. Catherine watched her children participate in this manufactured outdoor experience and grieved for the authentic sense of adventure and discovery that had made previous camping trips so valuable. They were still technically camping, still spending time in nature, still engaging in outdoor activities, but the spontaneity and genuine challenge that had made these experiences formative were gone. The cumulative impact of all these changes began to manifest in Catherine's relationship with William and their shared vision for their roles as working royals. Conversations that had once focused on their aspirations for public service and their hopes for their children's development now centered increasingly on adaptation and damage control, on finding ways to maintain some semblance of authentic engagement within increasingly restrictive constraints. William's perspective on these changes was shaped by his lifelong experience of royal restrictions and his understanding of the institutional requirements that would only intensify as they moved closer to the throne. He saw the current protocols as preparation for even greater constraints that would define their future roles. His ability to accept these limitations with equanimity was both admirable and sometimes frustrating to Catherine, who was still processing the loss of freedom she had briefly experienced. Their conversations revealed fundamental differences in their adaptation to royal life. William had never known the freedoms that Catherine was losing, so he experienced the changes as evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Catherine felt each restriction as a specific loss, a mourning process that required time and emotional energy to navigate successfully. But these conversations also deepened their partnership in important ways. William's understanding of the challenges Catherine was facing led to his increased advocacy within palace circles for modifications to protocols that might preserve some elements of family normalcy. Catherine's perspective on the human cost of institutional requirements helped William develop more nuanced approaches to his own future role as king. Together, they began developing strategies for maintaining family cohesion and personal identity within the evolving constraints of royal life. They established private family traditions that could exist within palace walls, created rituals of connection that didn't require public exposure, and found ways to preserve elements of their parenting philosophy within security requirements. The autumn brought a moment of clarity when Catherine was asked to deliver a speech about the importance of authentic relationships in child development. The irony of speaking about authenticity while living under increasingly artificial constraints was not lost on her, but preparing the speech forced her to articulate her understanding of what had been lost and what might still be preserved. In researching the speech, Catherine studied the childhood experiences of previous royal generations and recognized that each era had faced its own challenges in balancing institutional requirements with human development. The specific nature of the constraints changed with historical circumstances, but the fundamental tension between royal duty and personal fulfillment was a constant theme in royal life. This historical perspective helped Catherine understand her current situation not as a unique personal tragedy, but as the latest chapter in an ongoing institutional evolution. The protocols that felt so restrictive were responses to contemporary threats and challenges, just as previous generations had adapted to the security concerns and social expectations of their times. The speech itself became an opportunity for Catherine to articulate publicly her commitment to supporting children's authentic development within whatever constraints circumstances required. She spoke about resilience, adaptation, and the importance of finding meaning and connection even within difficult circumstances. But perhaps most importantly, the process of writing and delivering the speech helped Catherine begin to envision a new version of herself and her role that could accommodate both institutional requirements and personal values. She began to see the restrictions not just as losses, but as creative challenges that might lead to innovative forms of service and connection. The year concluded with Catherine's growing understanding that her role was evolving from that of a working royal who maintained elements of ordinary life to that of a symbolic figure whose primary function was to embody continuity and stability for the institution of monarchy. The restrictions that felt so personal were actually systematic transformations designed to prepare her for a role that transcended individual preferences and personal desires. This understanding brought both sadness and a strange form of peace. Catherine mourned the loss of freedoms and experiences that had shaped her sense of self, but she also began to find purpose in her evolution toward a role that served needs larger than her own. The woman who had once been Kate Middleton was indeed disappearing, but she was being replaced by something that might ultimately prove more significant. A queen-in-waiting who understood both the cost and the value of sacrifice in service of institutional continuity. As winter returned to Kensington Palace, Catherine stood once again at her bedroom window, watching her children play in the garden under the watchful eyes of their protection officers. The scene looked much the same as it had a year earlier, but everything had changed. The children had grown and adapted, the garden had endured another cycle of seasons, and Catherine herself had undergone a transformation that was both profound and irreversible. She was no longer the same person who had struggled to accept the first wave of protocol changes, nor was she the carefree mother who had once taken simple freedoms for granted. She had become something new, a woman who understood the true cost of royal service, and who had chosen to pay that price with dignity and purpose. The restrictions remained, and would likely intensify as the years passed. But Catherine had found ways to discover meaning and maintain connection within those constraints. She had learned to measure success not by freedoms preserved, but by service effectively rendered, not by personal fulfillment, but by institutional contribution. The future queen looked out at the garden where her children played and saw not a prison, but a sanctuary, not limitations, but preparation for roles that would serve their nation and their people in ways that transcended individual desires. The transformation was complete. The woman who had been Kate Middleton had evolved into Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and eventually she would become something even greater. A queen who understood both the privileges and the profound sacrifices that royal service demanded.